morning everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be discussing Ireland's budget for 2025. My name is Lisa Kinsella and I'll be your moderator for this morning's session. As we dive into the key details of yesterday's budget, we'll explore how the government plans to allocate resources, support economic growth and address the key challenges such as housing, healthcare and sustainability. We're joined by a fantastic panel of experts who'll provide insights on the budget's potential impact on various sectors and the economy as a whole. Whether you're a business leader, policy professional, or simply someone interested in Ireland's financial future, we hope this session will provide valuable perspectives and answers to your questions. In the first half of today's session, I'll be joined by some of our Crowe experts for a Q&A session. And in the second half, I'm delighted to be joined in studio by economist Jim Power. Right, so let's kick off with our Q&A. Joining us this morning are some of our colleagues from our tax and advisory departments. From the tax department, we have Tax Director Michael O'Scahill and Tax Associate Director Jennifer Farrell. From our Hotel, Tourism and Leisure department, we're joined by Weldon Mather, Head of that department. And last but not least, we're joined by Sean Buckley, an Associate in our Advisory department, who will share his insights on the impact Budget 2025 will have on our SMEs. Sean, we might start with you. As a key advisor to owners and their businesses, were you happy with the announcement in yesterday's budget?
Broadly, yes. This was a very expansionary budget. It's going to put a lot of money into consumers' pockets, which will ultimately find its way back into the coffers of the SMEs. I think they need it. It was only when Minister Chambers was speaking of the challenges facing this government that it kind of brought home to me what they've experienced over the last four years and how tumultuous it's been. You know, Brexit, pandemic, Ukraine, interest rates, which then came in through to energy shocks, inflation. The series of shocks they've faced over the last 4 years is quite frankly extraordinary. I think if anyone mentioned 4 years ago that we'd nearly forget about Brexit, I wouldn't have believed it. I think as it stands now, I'm very glad there was a focus on competitiveness and infrastructure in this budget. I think businesses are facing significant challenges. Luckily, interest rates and energy prices are coming back down, or at least they're moderating some degree, but wages are high. And I think we all know wages in this country are being driven primarily by housing. So I think the government and the minister in his speech today was very clear on the importance of infrastructure and getting housing solved. I think within that, there was three significant announcements. There was housing, water and power. And I think they're the key constraints. They recognise that it's a supply problem we have in this economy, more the demand problem. The LDA got an extra 1.25 billion, which now means it's got 6.25 billion to work with. The housing problem is a structural problem. It won't be fixed immediately, but with that kind of resources, you'd hope that it'll start to get resolved in the medium term. I think more broadly, in the business-specific taxes that was announced, it was nothing material. There was movements around the edges. The R&D credit moved from 50,000 to 75,000. The EIS moved from 500,000 to 1 million. The startup relief for entrepreneurs went from 700,000 to 980,000. And probably the biggest change is the CGT relief for innovative startups. The lifetime limit raised from 3 million to 10 million. Most of these, as I said, are tinkering around the edges. Probably the most innovative announcement today was the 1 million relief on listing a company. I think Irish SMEs in particular face significant challenges in access to capital. This will probably apply to very, very few companies, but at least it shows that the government has an understanding that access to capital is a challenge. And while this might not be the solution, at least it shows they're looking for solutions.
Thank you, Sean. Michael, as someone who advises family businesses on succession and estate planning, were some changes pending in that area in last year's budget that were causing some concern in business circles. Did the budget provide any respite in that regard?
Yes, Lisa, this refers to retirement relief, which is one of the key reliefs in this area. Now, broadly, retirement relief provides an exemption from CGT on the transfers of family trading businesses by parents to their children. Where the conditions are met, it can apply from age 55, albeit that there is a cap from age 66 of €3 million on the value of assets that can qualify. Now, last year's budget proposed to increase the age at which that cap applies from 66 to 70. However, it also proposed the introduction of a new cap of €10 million for those younger retirees where previously none applied. The changes were supposed to come into effect on the 1st of January 2025. Now, the difficulty here was that if the new cap was introduced, those businesses that are more valuable, typically with a value of more than €10 million in essence, that the tax cost of transferring them could be prohibitive for the parents. And in addition, this is what would often be referred to as a dry tax bill. In other words, the parents typically don't actually get any consideration or money for transferring the shares, but they do get a tax bill which they have to fund personally. And the concern then was that this might result in, family businesses that were earmarked or in the pipeline for transfer might not be transferred after all, and that instead they would either be retained by the parents for the long term, forever and a day if you like, or indeed that they might even be sold to third parties, neither of which would necessarily be in the best interests of the businesses and the communities they serve in all cases. So the past year has seen quite a lot of representations made to government in the area, with people looking to have the changes either reversed or softened in some way. In fact, it's interesting that the Commission for Tax and Welfare, which was itself the body that proposed the changes in the first place, had also recommended a deferral mechanism for the payment of tax in recognition of it being a dry tax bill. Now, the compromise that the government reached in yesterday's budget was to proceed with the changes, however, that where the cap is breached and a CGT liability created, that this CGT liability would only become payable if and when the children subsequently sell on the shares, and only if that's done within 12 years. Otherwise, the liability will effectively be abated. Now, needless to say, these changes, and indeed retirement relief more generally, it's a highly complex area. And anyone who thinks that they might be making a disposal that might qualify for it, very, very careful structuring is needed in advance to not fall foul of the dangers or the landmines.
And Michael, you mentioned the importance of structuring. What sort of things should those impacted be looking at?
Well, Lisa, I said it's a complex relief, but unfortunately sometimes it can be very simple to fall into some of the landmines. I mentioned there the €10 million cap or threshold. I suppose that is actually a cap per disponer, per transferor. So if there are two parents involved, could that be doubled to 20 million? And the answer was potentially yes. However, there are other conditions to be met for the relief to actually apply in the first place, and typically both parents would have to meet them. So you might inadvertently find yourself reducing the quantum of relief as opposed to doubling it by giving shares to both parents. Another point to bear in mind, we've spoken here, Lisa, about this relief being between parent and child. There is actually another smaller version of the relief that can apply where you sell your business, say, to a third party. Now, it's at a more modest level, 750,000 or 500,000 for the older retirees, as we call them. But needless to say, there is an awful lot of planning to be done in order to ensure that you fall within those thresholds and to maximise use of the relief.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah. And sticking with capital taxes, Jennifer, as a private client expert who regularly advises clients on managing estate affairs, can you talk us through the changes announced in yesterday's budget in relation to tax-free thresholds? And do you think these increases were sufficient?
Yes, Lisa. So during the budget, the Minister announced some well-signalled CAT increases to the thresholds. The headline CAT threshold, which relates to gifts and inheritances from parents to children, that increased from 335,000 to 400,000. And there are also some moderate increases in the other two thresholds. While this is welcome, these changes, I had hoped to see higher increases in the thresholds, particularly given the the high and rapid increase of property prices over the last couple of years. So I do think there's a long way to go in relation to getting the thresholds up to the level that matches the current market. Just by comparison, the 400,000 threshold, it's still actually €142,544 below the 2008 limit, and even earlier years before that. I also do think there was a missed opportunity in relation to the small gift exemption. So the small gift exemption allows someone to receive €3,000 from an individual free of CAT. We would like to have seen this increased in the budget. We do think it's a missed opportunity, as we find that a lot of our clients actually utilise that benefit.
Mm-hmm. So hopefully we'll see it maybe next year.
Hopefully.
And Jennifer, just staying with you now on income taxes, as expected, tax relief has been provided to individuals through a number of income tax changes. Mm-hmm. How will this change affect the employee in their net pay?
Yeah, so that's what everyone wants to know. So similar to the budgets over the last couple of years, there has been huge income tax benefits which do affect the average worker. So they want to know, how much money am I going to have in my back pocket, which is important. So some of the changes that have been brought in, there has been an increase to some of the main tax credits. So the employee credit, the personal and the earned tax credits, they've all increased by €125. The standard rate cut-off point, that's increased by €2,000 up to €44,000, and that applies in proportion to married couples and civil partners. Furthermore, the USC rate of 4%, that's been reduced to 3%, and the entry level to the 3% threshold, that's also increased. So there's a lot of savings there. Furthermore, there was a rent credit, people might remember, was introduced in budget 2023. That's been increased by a further €250. So it means that individuals benefit from a tax credit of €1,000, and jointly assessed individuals, couples, they can benefit from a €2,000 tax credit. So not insignificant. So I suppose, what does it mean in numbers to the average worker? So by way of example, a single earner earning €50,000 who is renting at the moment, they're looking to save €1,109 in 2005. A married couple, one earner earning €80,000, they will save €1,154 next year in 2005. Some other measures that were introduced, some of the social welfare payments, they were all increased. There were student fees, they're going to be cut by €1,000, and there is an energy credit of €250, which are all welcome measures. So obviously, the relieving measures were expected, they're welcome, but there was an expectation that there would be further income tax cuts and maybe further tax relief, particularly to ease the financial burden on lower and middle income earners. So in particular, we noticed that many of the individuals, they're still in the higher tax bracket, so it does mean that there is still an additional tax burden on them.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thanks, Lisa.
Well done. As someone who has worked in the tourism and hospitality sector for over 30 years, what are your thoughts on yesterday's budget? And did it go far enough to help businesses, most of which are SMEs and family businesses?
So Lisa, it's fair to say there's huge disappointment in the budget across the sectors. Crowe has long advocated for measures to support small and medium-sized enterprises, such as family businesses, which are the lifeblood of the tourism and hospitality business right across the country. Tourism employs over 250,000 people nationally and has the greatest spatial reach, and as I say, is a major employer. But the margins are really tight, and we see that with our clients, and we see it across the sectors. So the announcements yesterday were disappointing, to say the least. There was a genuine belief that right up until the last minute there might be a compromise on the VAT around 11%, somewhere in the middle. But around 11 o'clock last night, the budget, it was announced that the VAT was not going to happen, and unfortunately this critical measure did not get passed.
And so, Weldon, what other measures are exercising the tourism and hospitality industry? For example, what about the minimum wage or sick pay, auto-enrolment and similar other measures?
Yeah, so I suppose not getting the VAT reduced back to 9% was the main blow, but it's further compounded by, as you rightly say, the minimum wage. So from the 1st of January 2025, that's going to increase by 80 cents, which doesn't sound a huge amount, but that is a 6.3% increase. And that's going to have a knock-on effect on other people who are just above the minimum wage. And businesses just won't be able to absorb these costs. In fact, we're heading for what we call the living wage, which the Low Pay Commission, I understand, has pitched to be close enough to €15. So in time, and it's not that far away, this is where the wage cost is going to go. The issue around pension auto-enrolment is coming, and that will be effective from the 30th of September 2025. I suppose one temporary reprieve has been around the paid sick leave, which is currently 5 days. It was due to go to 7 days this year and ultimately to 10 days. That looks like it's on hold, but there are other challenges for the industry, such as the cost of goods, such as food and beverage and so on. So industry is facing severe headwinds, and it is very, very concerning.
But is there any good news?
Well, it's not, in fairness, it's not all bad news, and government will point to other measures that they've taken to support the industry. The main one, which is very interesting, been billed in the media as the Power Up grant in the form of a cash injection of €4,000 for qualifying businesses. Now, this is going to be interesting because to be a qualifying business, you need to have a commercial rates bill of less than €30,000 in the previous year, but that only works out at €77 per week. So it'll be interesting to see what effect that will have. Another kind of positive one was the increased VAT threshold for goods and services from €80,000 to €85,000 and €40,000 to €42,500 respectively. So that will keep some smaller businesses out of the tax net, such as B&Bs and smaller SME family businesses. It's also been reported that €61 million has been allocated to the Tourism Marketing Fund, which is great, and a further €36 million has been allocated to the Fáilte Ireland Capital Spend Fund, so good for visitor attractions. Another one that was quite interesting, Minister Paschal Donohoe announced a €170 million energy subsidy scheme for hospitality and retail businesses that have been hit by rising energy costs, and that will support around 39,000 firms. And then briefly, employees will benefit from the 80-cent increase in their pay, but ultimately the cost of living is increasing, and that kind of leads nicely into the whole inflation piece, this area of perceived inflation. There's a concern that consumers actually think that inflation is still really high, even though the headline rate has reduced significantly. And I think the last one there is around labour availability, which is still a major issue and concern, getting people to work in the industry. So headwinds all around, I suppose, but we'll wait and see what the year shall bring.
So some positives, but still very much an industry under pressure.
Under significant pressure, and again, we feel it was a missed opportunity to bring in more significant supports for that sector.
Thank you, Eldon.
Thanks, Lisa.
We might now move to FDI, Michael. There's been much talk about the importance of FDI to the Irish economy. Did this budget contain any measures that might help attract investors into the country?
Well, yes, Lisa, but as ever, maybe the devil is in the detail, and it could be a case of maybe good intentions, but will they be followed through on? For the past year, we've heard a lot of talk about a participation exemption for foreign dividends. It was actually mooted in last year's budget. A consultation process was launched, which was referred to again yesterday. Currently, an Irish holding company with foreign subsidiaries, if it receives dividends from those subsidiaries, in most cases, they end up not having to pay any additional Irish tax, which is good. But it's quite a circuitous process to get there, taking a lot of explaining to clients, a number of complex calculations and a lot of entries on the tax return. It'd be much simpler if they just simply exempted it in the first place to get to the same result. Now we wait the outcome of that consultation process, but it seems to be moving along, and hopefully we get a positive outcome that will make life easier for these FDIs. Another area that would be of interest to them, I think, would be the whole area of share-based remuneration. This is an area, I suppose, that's very important, particularly for American multinationals and foreign direct investors. Now, again, the government have been looking at this, and indeed they commissioned Indicon to produce a report, which was published yesterday. Now, one of the areas covered in that report was a thing called restricted stock units, or RSUs, which, in plain language, is an award of shares that the employees will typically convert to cash. Now, they're subject to income tax. But under Irish tax law, the individual, when the RSUs vest, they have to pay tax on all of them, even though they might very well, particularly for internationally mobile employees, they might have actually earned them where they were working somewhere completely different, outside Ireland. Now, the proposal in the Indicon report is that an apportionment method be applied so that they're only taxed on the element of the RSU that was earned while working in Ireland. Now, that would bring us more in line with most of our international competitors, if you like, and would possibly be a boost for foreign direct investors in this country. So again, we await to see what comes of that.
Thanks, Michael. Sean, we might end with a final question for yourself. How do you think business owners fared in this year's budget? Is it the case that the Minister has just reinforced previous measures? Or do you think there were any new exciting offerings?
I think broadly, no. It's been a lot of tinkering around the edges. As I mentioned earlier, there's been some reliefs have increased. They're broadly positive moves. The few bits of innovation are very specific on unscripted movies, on the production of mead, on VAT and heat pumps. So, these are beyond highly targeted. So I think it's been a very steady as she goes. There's certainly some challenges come in. The minimum wage is certainly, as well alluded to, is certainly a challenge for a lot of SMEs, and that does push up kind of broader wage levels across the board. The pension auto-enrolment is something that is now coming. It's been kicked down the can numerous times at this point, kicked down the road. I think that's something we have to get done. I know it sounds counterintuitive as we're pro-SME here, but I think ultimately we're the only country in the OECD without it, and our demographics are aging pretty rapidly, so we have to get there. But I think there was an opportunity to do it in a slightly more clever way. If you take where the auto-enrolment came from, it was originally kind of started in Australia, and they brought it out in the 80s in a highly inflationary period, similar to what we've just gone through here. And what they essentially did was, instead of wage increases, they got employees to kick some cash into their pension, and the government kicked in a significant amount of cash. I think given we are trying to take some money out of the economy, we're running pretty hot. There was a great opportunity for the government to put some money into those pension funds for people who are basically starting pension for the first time ever. I think there was a sense that politically there may not have been many votes in it because people don't really know. It seems like it's locked away and hard to know what that is. But I think if people saw, actually my pension fund now has €2,000 in it, I think it might create more value than maybe or maybe more voter power than maybe they anticipated. I was put in general, the budget, the economy is running on the edge of hot. The Fiscal Advisory Council would say we're possibly running a little bit too hot. But as you mentioned, well, then inflation's down sub 2%. I think with the election that's coming, it was never not going to be quite a supportive budget. And I think ultimately the extra cash that's going into the economy will find its way into businesses. Some of them in some sectors are certainly challenged, but broadly it's a slightly positive step.
So that brings our Q&A session to an end. I want to thank our panel for their very invaluable insights into Budget 2025.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
I'm delighted to welcome Jim Power back to studio to discuss the economic impact of yesterday's budget. Jim is a prominent Irish economist recognised for his deep insights into the Irish economy and its global connections. With over 3 decades of experience, Jim has become a well-known commentator on economic trends, policy and financial markets in both national and international media. He is the owner of Jim Power Economics, an economic and financial consultancy practice which he set up in 2009. He was previously Treasury Economist at AIB, Chief Economist at Bank of Ireland and Chief Economist at Friends First. He is a board director of Love Irish Foods, BMW and the Arboretum Garden Centre. In February 2021, Jim and Chris Johns launched their own podcast, The Other Hand, which is currently one of my favourite weekly current affairs podcasts. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and other podcast hosts. Jim lives in Dublin, but he is a native of Waterford, which was recently recognised as a must-visit destination in 2024 by Condé Nast. Jim, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us, and we might get started.
Thank you, Lisa. Delighted to be here again.
Great. How would you describe the economic and fiscal backdrop of Budget 2025, both in the context of Ireland and internationally?
It was a fascinating budget in so many respects. If you think about since this government came to power, they've had to deal with Brexit, they've had to deal with COVID, they've had to deal with the Ukraine crisis, escalating inflation, rising interest rates, a very, very unusual environment. And in setting Budget 2025, actually, there was another very unusual set of circumstances. Never before had two ministers such an abundance of wealth at their disposal to give out on budget day. Before the budget was delivered yesterday, last Friday night, the Department of Finance published the white paper on receipts and expenditure, and that basically shows you the Exchequer position before any budget day changes. And it was projecting that in 2024 there will be a surplus of over 25 billion. And in 2025, they were projecting a surplus of just over 12 billion. On top of that, we had the 14.1 billion Apple tax judgment. We had 3.5 billion from the sale of AIB shares, and there's a surplus of 1.5 billion in the National Training Fund. So a lot of money, and from a government perspective, you know, this offered an amazing opportunity to do something meaningful. And I think what we got yesterday was something meaningful in some senses, in that it was a massive budget package. Basically, a lot of money was thrown at a lot of people. No single individual will be terribly better off as a result, because it was scattered very narrowly across or thinly across the economy. But in overall terms, it was a very, very enviable position for two ministers to have to deliver and frame a budget. And of course, what made it particularly interesting was the fact that this is the last budget of the current government, because we have to have a general election before the 22nd of March next year. So clearly, while they will claim it wasn't a pre-election budget, it absolutely was a pre-election budget, whatever way you look at it.
And you mentioned an abundance of wealth, Jim. You know, was yesterday's budget just, I suppose, a free-for-all in advance of the election, or is there any part of yesterday's announcement that recognises the reality of our economic situation?
Well, I think first and foremost, you know, it has to be seen as a pre-election budget, because, you know, at the end of the day, the current government would appear very inclined to come back to government together, at least Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And, you know, if the Greens do well enough in election, I suspect they would like to come back into government. So there was very much an element of playing politics. But I think there was also a number of important issues in the economy that needed to be addressed, or at least budget tried to address. You know, one was the cost of living crisis, because although the headline inflation rate has fallen from a high of 9.2% back in October 22 to just 0.2% in September, you know, so the rate has come down dramatically, but yet the cost of living today is about 20% higher than it was 3 years ago. So that's what we mean by the cost of living crisis. And certainly there was a massive focus on that cost of living crisis over recent months, and it certainly played a huge part in the budget that was delivered. There was also an issue with the cost of business that has been escalated over the last few years. Energy costs have gone up, labour costs have gone up, insurance costs have gone up. So all of the costs of doing business have escalated quite significantly. So there was obviously pressure on the government to do something to help the business sector, particularly the SME sector. So I think they were the two sort of short-term issues that the budget was intended to deal with. And then there were the longer-term issues, of course, and the government has said that the 17 billion from the Apple tax and the AIB share sales will be used to improve Ireland's infrastructure in the long term. In other words, capital investment in areas like energy, water, in general infrastructure, and of course the transport system. And in Budget 2025, they set aside $3 billion to put towards some of those issues next year. And the rest of that money, the intention is that it will be rolled out over the coming years to invest in infrastructure. So I think there was three sort of forces at play here. One, as I said, was the imminence of a general election. Secondly, these short-term issues with the cost of living and the cost of doing business. And thirdly, the longer-term perspective on investing in Ireland's infrastructure and long-term growth potential.
And do you think then, from an economic perspective, that, you know, the key priorities have been addressed, that they were addressed in the budget?
Well, they were to a large extent, because if you think about the budget package, last July the government published the summer economic statement, and that basically set the parameters for the budget. And at that stage, they said the package would be 8.3 billion, 6.9 billion of that would be expenditure measures, and 1.4 billion would be taxation measures. And that's exactly the package that was delivered yesterday. But on top of that, and this is where the budgetary arithmetic becomes a little bit confusing, they had a once-off €2 billion cost of living package. Okay, so you know you add that basically onto the 8.4 billion, and you're talking about a package just under 10.5 billion. And then to confuse it even further, we have this commitment to spend on infrastructure investment, the 3 billion that's targeted for 2025. So in a nutshell, they did throw a lot of money at the areas that needed to be addressed. In terms of the cost of living, the panel of your colleagues, you've discussed the sort of tax changes that were made, you know, and basically I think the real target of the budget in terms of personal taxation was to help middle income workers. And the morning of the budget, Simon Harris said that he would make no apologies for the fact that he wanted to give money back to people who own that money. So, and that's exactly what was delivered in the budget in terms of the personal tax side, and a lot of stuff also on the expenditure side. So a lot of money will be pumped into the pockets of households and consumers over the next 12 months. And I think what was also a little bit unusual, amongst many things that were unusual in this budget, was the fact that a large part of that 2 billion cost of living package will be implemented before the end of 2024, which in itself is unusual again. But yeah, I mean, that was a key focus, putting money back in. In terms of helping business, I would be a lot less convinced about that. Personally, I was deeply disappointed that the VAT rate for the hospitality sector wasn't cut from 13.5% to 9%. I wasn't remotely surprised, but I was very disappointed because apparently it had been up for discussion up until the late hours on the night before the budget, but it didn't happen. As I say, I wasn't surprised because you know, I don't believe too many in government actually wanted to do it. The Department of Finance certainly didn't want to do it, so they all got their way, and the hospitality sector is justifiably not happy. And the other business supports that were put in place that have been discussed, there's a lot of sort of bits and pieces, and I suspect a lot of the financial aid to small businesses will prove very difficult to actually draw down. It'll be bureaucratic, and that is very often the case, I think, with these business support packages that are put in place. So I think from a business perspective, not quite as positive, although, you know, having said that, I guess at the end of the day, when you pump money into the pockets of consumers, they will go out and spend that money, and that of course benefits businesses as well. But in terms of direct support for businesses, I don't think a lot was done. And as I say, I think the hospitality sector is the sector that is probably under most pressure in the economy at the moment and did not get very much out of that budget.
And I think my colleague Weldon would agree with you on that point.
Yes, yeah. he would indeed. Yeah, absolutely. I heard him say that earlier.
So turning now, I suppose, to FDI, my colleague Michael spoke briefly about Ireland's attractiveness from an FDI perspective in relation to our tax offerings. I'm just wondering, how does yesterday's budget address the non-tax part of our FDI offerings?
Okay, far be it for me to become an expert on corporation tax, but Pillar 2 of the OECD tax deal has been implemented. The minimum tax of 15% for companies with turnover in excess of 750 million. The Pillar 1, which is due to be implemented, it's proving difficult to reach international agreement, but one assumes, I think, that it will eventually be implemented in some form. And once that happens, I think, Ireland's corporation tax advantage is just being gradually chipped away. And I think the Apple ruling was another part of that process. Okay, so is that the end of the world for FDI in Ireland? No, it shouldn't be, because I think we now need to start focusing on the other elements of the foreign direct investment offering. And I think all the while remembering that if you want to identify, I think, the greatest vulnerability in the Irish economy at the moment. Back in 2007, it was the over-reliance on property and construction. Today, it is the over-reliance on the FDI sector. 10 multinational companies accounting for 54% of corporation tax, and then a massive percentage of income tax coming from workers in the FDI sector. So we have a very significant dependence there. So we do really need to focus, I think, very aggressively on the non-tax elements. So to me, the most important ones are energy is really important. Physical infrastructure like roads and connectivity is very important. The IT infrastructure is very important. Water supply is very important. Education and the supply of a highly skilled labour force is incredibly important. And indeed, other public services like health, all of these things, and housing, of course.
Yes.
How could I forget housing?
Forget.
But all of these things do form the non-tax competitiveness elements of what Ireland offers. And we are under pressure under a lot of those headings, particularly housing, energy and water. And I know leaders in the FDI sector have alluded to that fact. And of course, we've had the decision recently to turn down planning for the data centre for Google. That does not send out a good signal about Ireland. So that's why it is absolutely essential that we invest as aggressively as possible in all of those areas. And, I have to say that the budget that was delivered yesterday, did go some way in that direction. But the point now is we've got to take a long-term perspective on this. We've got to spend money on infrastructure rather than on sort of once-off cost of living measures, largely garnered to win votes. We need to take a long-term strategic perspective here, because if we don't invest in all of those areas, well, then ultimately our reliance on FDI could become very, very damaging and dangerous for the economy. So I would hope what we saw yesterday is the first step in this sort of long-term strategic direction. People might argue that, well, they didn't do enough on housing, they didn't do enough on whatever. But the reality is as well, there is a limit to the capacity of the housing sector to deliver housing. You can't just throw a lot of money in there in the hope that you'll get the returns. It has to be done on a sort of a phased basis. And we got an indication of that in the budget yesterday. I just hope now that actually it does form a part of our long-term strategic planning. And the immediate one, of course, is housing. I've argued for a long time that socially, economically, politically, housing is the number one issue in the economy at the moment. And we really do need to get that up and running. But I would also say that throwing money at housing isn't the whole of the solution either, because there are issues around delivery, like the capacity of the construction sector, but also the whole planning system is certainly not amenable to the delivery of housing in the quantity that we require at this stage. So there's a lot to be done, but I think it is really important to recognise the risk on the FDI side, the concentration risk, and make sure we do whatever we have to do to remain as favourable as possible for foreign direct investment in the economy. And I'm not saying that all of our eggs should be in the FDI basket. It is also obviously important to focus in on the SME side of the economy. And the two sectors that stand out there, of course, are tourism and the agri-food sector. and I think tourism will be a little bit disappointed because of the VAT rate.
Absolutely. And I suppose just, going across the water, which probably is something that will be important for us, the US presidential election is just around the corner on the 5th of November. What would the implications be for Ireland, depending on who becomes the next president?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating year on the political front. I mean, coming into 2024, we were describing it as the year of elections. A lot of countries around the world with elections, the most recent one being Austria at the weekend. But the big one was always going to be the US presidential election on November 5th. And that has been an extraordinary campaign to date, with Joe Biden dropping out, Kamala Harris stepping in. A significant lead for Trump when Biden was running has been overturned, and Kamala Harris is now narrowly in the lead. So there's a lot to play for in the next less than 3 months at this stage. And I think from a purely Irish perspective, we all have our views on Trump.
Yeah.
We like him or we don't. And I think that's kind of irrelevant whether we like him or not. I think being purely selfish about this, looking at their policies, the corporation tax rate in the United States is 21%. Okay, Trump has spoken about cutting it to 15%. Kamala Harris has spoken about increasing it to 28%. Okay, that may never happen, but that's what they've been saying, because Kamala Harris particularly wants to increase the rate to fund middle-class tax cuts. Okay, so from an Irish perspective, a 28% corporation tax rate delivered by Harris would be absolutely nirvana. It would really cement our attraction for US multinational companies, whereas a 15% corporation tax rate could be potentially disastrous. So I think from an Irish perspective, we should really be hoping that Harris wins this election. The other area, I think, of interest would be the attitude of both candidates towards free trade, globalization, because at the end of the day, and this is being purely selfish about it again, Ireland is one of the most globalized economies in the world. Our dependence on exports is huge. Our dependence on foreign direct investment is huge. So we really are at the cutting edge of globalization. And Trump particularly is very anti-free trade. He was during his first presidency, and nothing much seems to have changed. He has spoken initially about a 10% tariff on all imports into the United States from everywhere, 60% from China, but 10% everywhere else. And he has recently spoken about 20% tariffs on imports from everywhere. So a 20% tariff on Irish exports to the United States would be bad news. And indeed, anything that would diminish global free trade would be bad news for Ireland, given how globalised we are. In terms of Harris in that regard, she's not terribly different. She definitely has instincts of economic nationalism and protection and tariffs, nothing like to the same extent as Donald Trump. And I think the one thing that Harris really has going for her, as far as I'd be concerned, is the fact that she has much more of a conciliatory attitude to international relations, particularly the relationship with Europe, whereas Donald Trump has been antagonistic towards most countries, but particularly Europe during his last presidency. So, we need to look very closely at the outcome of that election, and I guess more importantly, the policies that flow from that. And obviously, there's nothing we can do to influence that other than, I go back to the point, to make sure that Ireland remains as favourable for foreign direct investment as possible. We cannot lose our cutting edge. We can, of course, try and, I guess, work down our dependence on the United States. There are other economies out there that we could build significant relationships with, Canada being one, for example. So I think we need to diversify our exposure to exports and foreign direct investment. And we've done that very successfully in relation to the UK since the 1970s, so it's not impossible. But the States is a really important election. And, the opinion polls would certainly suggest in the swing states, it is still too close to call. So it could go either way. But from an Irish selfish perspective, I think a Harris victory would definitely be better news for the Irish economy.
So it sounds like you're going to have to start promoting Harris on the podcast now over the next few months.
Yeah, but I think we've, for what it's worth, we've been generally quite positive towards her. It's not difficult to be positive towards somebody who's running against Trump, to be honest.
Agreed.
You know, it's an easy job.
Agreed. We'll say no more. And Jim, just looking forward, what impact will yesterday's budget have on the Irish economy in 2025? Is there any risk of overheating?
Whoa, that is the really
Yeah.
interesting question. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council has been warning the government for some time. Most recently in September, it does a pre-budget statement where it was warning the government against fiscal profligacy, basically saying that this economy does not need massive fiscal stimulus, that it risks overheating the economy and so on. And the second, I guess, part of IFAC's warning to government would be that all of these tax bounties, that they should either be used to pay down debt saved in the sovereign funds we've set up, or else invested in infrastructure, or a combination of all three. But in terms of the overheating, and sorry, I should also say that while I'd have a lot of sympathy with that IFAC view of the world, I think it ignores the political reality. You know, there is an election over the coming weeks or months, and this was always going to be a pre-election budget, which is exactly what it is. So the question about overheating, I'm just not convinced about that part of IFAC's argument. I don't see too many signs of overheating in the economy. Okay, the labour market is very strong, 4.3% unemployment rate, 2.7 million people employed, the highest level ever. Tax revenues are very strong. The housing market is still very strong, but that to me is not a sign of overheating. It's not being driven by credit, as was the case last time. It's just being driven by a fundamental imbalance between demand and supply. And I don't see that as a symptom of overheating. And I guess the other two parts I would look at, the inflation rate is now down at 0.2%. That is not indicative of an overheated economy. And the other point is that the consumer side of the economy is very definitely under some pressure. You know, consumer spending has slowed, and at the in the year to August, for example, the volume of retail sales was 2.5% down on a year earlier. So that's not indicative of an economy that's overheating. So I think that overheating argument is a little bit overdone, certainly at the moment. The money that's been pumped in Budget 2025 will obviously boost growth further, and particularly the consumer side of the economy. And I don't think government will be terribly upset about that, because not a bad thing to have in the run-up to an election, a little bit of consumer confidence in there. So it will be positive for the economy in the aggregate, there's no doubt about that. Will it lead to significant overheating of the economy? I don't believe it will, because I just think we're in a very different place today than we were in 2007. There are, of course, always warning signs, and we need to be very careful. But if you look at the external economic environment, you know, it is still very, very challenged at the moment, particularly Europe. So it's not exactly as if the world is on fire. So that is going to impact on Ireland. So in a nutshell, I've gone around the house in answering this question. Budget 25 will be good for growth in the economy. Will it lead to overheating and a surge in inflation? I don't believe it will.
That's great. And it sounds like we're ending on a positive note. I want to thank you for your contribution. We're always delighted to have you, and particularly this year that you were able to join us in studio. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Lisa. Absolutely delighted.
Thank you. So that concludes this morning's webinar. Thanks to all our viewers for joining. I hope you found the session interesting. Thanks also to all our contributors this morning, especially Jim Power. We hope to see you all again next year.